Welcome, everybody. My name is Paul Bramadet. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, and I'm going to take my mask off because I can do that. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to a public lecture that is both a standalone talk, similar in format to the rest of our annual lecture series, as well as one of the deliverables of an interdisciplinary research workshop. The workshop concerns the intersection between the advanced study of religion and spirituality on the one hand, and the kinds of real-world challenges facing contemporary healthcare on the other hand. We are working in partnership on this workshop with the Faculty of Humanities, the Center for Global Studies, the Island Medical Program, and the Vice President Research and Innovation, and we're very pleased to acknowledge their support. Yesterday, we featured a lecture at noon by a specialist in medical humanities, Dr. Jain McNaughton from Durham University. Today, I'm delighted to introduce to you Dr. Andrea Jain from Indiana University. Andrea is a specialist in the connections between religion and capitalism, modern postural yoga, gender, sexuality, and global spirituality. She's widely published and unlike many academics, widely read. In addition to publishing articles in the leading journals in our field, as well as in the popular press, Andrea's books include Peace, Love, Yoga, The Politics of Global Spirituality in 2020, and Selling Yoga from Counterculture to Pop Culture in 2014, both by Oxford University Press. Andrea is the editor of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, which is sort of to religious studies what the Lancet is to the medical world, for those of you who are on Zoom and YouTube. I thought I'd share that. I was so impressed by Andrea's work when I first encountered it in about 2015, I invited her to anchor a one-day event on the politics of yoga in, I think, 2017 in the summer. That interaction was the beginning, not just of a very productive intellectual engagement over the years, but also, I'm very pleased to say, a cherished personal friendship. So when we were putting together this workshop on medical and health humanities, it was clear to me that we would need to invite Andrea back to be with us today. Today, she will lead us into some of the connections that she's making between her existing research trajectory and the lessons we are all learning from the pandemic. Of course, one of the things we are learning is precisely how fragile our bodies, our societies, and our planet are. And in Canada, of course, the pandemic has been teaching us these lessons at the same time as we've been learning closely connected lessons about the impact of colonialism on Indigenous people in this country. And so to conclude my introductory remarks, I want to acknowledge with respect the Kwangman people on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Jain.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you, Paul, for those lovely introductory words. And I'm going to also demask since I'm well distanced. Thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure to be a part of this workshop and to engage with colleagues from all over. And so I wanted to start with some of the premises of this workshop. One is that scholars of health, religion, and society are uniquely poised to help our colleagues, governments, and other members of our communities come to terms with the relevance of spirituality, from yoga to Reiki to mindfulness, for our understanding of health. And another premise was that we're uniquely poised to open up critical conversations about how the pandemic has illuminated existing tensions between conventional health norms on the one hand, and personal and political forms of spirituality on the other. I'm going to suggest that one thing we learn by how these forms of spirituality are used to treat pain and illness is that they can serve to contain our descent against the forces that caused pain and illness to begin with. They can serve as gestural subversions against the status quo. In other words, they can help us bypass issues of structural violence. So consider this. It's funny, Paul mentioned the Lancet. Just a few weeks ago, an editorial was published in the Lancet that was signed by more than 200 health and medical journal editors. And this collective editorial called for a rapid response to combat climate change, suggesting governments cooperate and invest in the environmental crisis with the same degree of funding and urgency with which they confronted the pandemic. Quote, "The science is unequivocal. A global increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average and the continued loss of biodiversity risk catastrophic harm to health that will be impossible to reverse." End quote. Indeed, no temperature rise is safe. The editors represented every continent in a wide range of medical and health disciplines, from ophthalmology to pediatric medicine, in leading international journals. They raised concerns not only about the direct health consequences of rising temperatures, including heat-related mortality, other extreme weather events, pregnancy complications, and cardiovascular disease, but also the indirect costs, including the effects that soil depletion could have on malnutrition and the possibility that widespread destruction of non-human animal habitats could increase the likelihood of future pandemics. All of us here have become aware at some point of just how damaged the planet is. Whether or not we've been deeply changed by that knowledge, it's not something that we can unknow. We cannot unswallow the truth. Given the realities of planetary crisis and pandemic, I'm suggesting that scholars concerned with social justice in healthcare should center not the value of spirituality as a personal embodied practice, but rather the importance of relationality, and more specifically, how representatives and representations of religion and spirituality in healthcare, in various healthcare settings, might or might fail to address humans' relationships with environmental bodies and non-human animals. To put it differently, if we're to continue our scholarship at all, instead of forfeiting in the face of apocalypse, we, even and especially those of us working in the humanities, must work on a response to the planetary crisis. The purpose of our work is primarily threefold, I think. First, it's to remind scientists and health experts that equity must be at the center of our response. Second, it's to help human societies repair their relationships with environmental bodies and non-human animals. And third, it's to diagnose capitalism's death-dealing structures and in turn the causes of ecological death, in the hope that activists, the self-described non-compliant, in turn can build on those to imagine radically different futures. Now, it might sound like a big leap from spirituality and healthcare to environmental justice and humans' relationships with non-human animals. But here's what we know. The consequences of the meat, dairy, and wildlife industries and the ongoing destruction of habitats are devastating for humanity. The meat and dairy industries are highly dependent on fossil fuels, greatly increasing emissions of the greenhouse gas CO2, and the animals themselves produce huge quantities of methane, another greenhouse gas. The animal agriculture industries demand enormous amounts of water. On a massive scale, land is cleared to grow grain to feed the animals that humans will later consume. We know that the current planetary crisis and pandemic disproportionately harm the most vulnerable human communities, including children, older populations, ethnic and racial minorities, poorer communities, women, and those with underlying health problems and disabilities. In the United States and Canada, for example, Black people are twice as likely to die from COVID-19. Indigenous people are more than twice as likely to die from it. Factors commonly related to race and ethnicity, including lower socioeconomic status, lack of access to adequately healthy food, including plant-based food, and healthcare, and increased exposure to the virus while at work, put them at increased risk. This is why yesterday, as Jain mentioned, Some are calling our current global situation a syndemic, in which COVID health disparities, economic disparities, and systemic racism intersect to cause pain, illness, and death. The consequences of the meat, dairy, and wildlife industries and the ongoing destruction of habitats are devastating for humanity. Imagine their implications for non-human animals. Each of them is a living being with their own personality and very much capable of physical and psychological suffering. Humans cage or otherwise contain them, commodify them, condemn them to a life of stress, fear, and pain, profit off of them, and eat them. Given the role of our disregard for the environment and our commodification and consumption of non-human animals in contributing to the current planetary crisis and pandemic, the two greatest public health threats today, any discussion of healthcare should also address our relationship with environmental and non-human animal bodies. So I want to back up now and explain why I have termed forms of popular spirituality, the kind that we often find in healthcare settings, from yoga to mindfulness, neoliberal spirituality. And I want to illustrate how my thinking about environmental justice builds on the work I've been doing over the past several years on religion and capitalism in spiritual industries. I tease out self-care practices' deep elective affinity with capitalist dynamics and the tendency to wed the goal of material prosperity to self-care in the quest for freedom from oppression, pain, suffering, rooted in some form of ancient or exotic wisdom. Personal growth, self-care, transformation, these are some of the generative tropes in the narrative of the relevant industries. Huge swaths of consumers in global cities all over the world spend their money on self-care. Hence the emergence of large transnational organizations, corporations, indeed entire industries producing neoliberal spirituality's commodities. Increasingly, healthcare systems reflect the growth in mainstreaming of these industries and their products and practices. We see increasing attention in medical contexts to what are called self-management programs, which can include practices like yoga and mindfulness in doctors' offices, therapists' offices, hospitals, and research projects. Neoliberal governmentality, by which I mean forms of spirituality or forms of governance that hold the individual responsible for their own conditions of oppression, pain, or suffering, can be seen at play in self-management discourses of self-sufficiency, which reify the individual, construed as ideally self-optimizing, self-empowering, and self-sustaining. When we speak of self-care commodities that proponents and consumers describe as empowering, transformative, or liberating, we're not usually talking about things that challenge or weaken dominant hierarchies. In fact, much of those industries' products are rooted in concerns about deviancy, especially in the form of low work productivity, which intersects with the judgment that people have failed to adequately engage in self-care or that they're non-compliant with doctors' orders. The prescriptions for self-care or personal liberation have little or nothing to do with societal transformation. In other words, rather they denote the requirements for more productive, efficient, and conforming workers and consumers. As the demands on people to work and be productive have increased, so we've seen an increase in yoga teachers, natural dietary systems, spiritual athleisure wear, and mindfulness courses, which for the most part claim to enhance productivity and simultaneously conformity to a rigid moral, not to mention bodily standard. Put differently, self-care or spiritual industries support neoliberal capitalism, both in the pursuit of surplus value and ideological control. That is, by reinforcing its structures, norms, and values, and punishing deviations from them. Neoliberal politics are visible in the discourses and practices of some of the industry's most powerful corporations and proponents, and now in medical schools and hospitals around the world. We witness the creation of deviant outgroups in the marketing strategies that idealize self-governance and a narrow vision of the female or male bodies, as well as international research in pain medicine that assumes patients should take responsibility for their chronic pain and claim that the members of such groups are non-compliant when they don't consume the right interventions to cultivate health, work productivity, and self-improvement, rather than investigate the structural obstacles with regard to access. A wide range of commodities, yoga mats, mindfulness, mala beads, crystals, natural foods, anything with Zen printed across it. These are considered good consumer choices, products that lead to better living outcomes. If you are unhappy, unwell, stressed, in pain, or not the proper weight, that's because you're not making the right choices. You're not choosing or buying the right stuff. Where you are is on you. Changing your conditions is your responsibility. Gender is central, not peripheral, to neoliberal spirituality's operations, especially insofar as heteropatriarchy shapes the ways authority is demarcated and exercised, such that structural transformation is sometimes decentered as the solution to gender inequities. Rather, resolving those challenges is a burden placed on the shoulders of the disenfranchised, that is, women and other gender and sexual minorities. Programs for self-care, in other words, are not an individual's tool for breaking the glass ceiling. Sorry, they're an individual's tool for breaking the glass ceiling, not dismantling the ceiling. It should not surprise us then that self-management programs are increasingly encouraged for sufferers of chronic pain, which affects a higher proportion of women than men globally. Studies show that women are nonetheless less likely to receive treatments such as medication, and this even though they generally experience more recurrent pain, more severe pain, and longer lasting pain than men. So if you're a working mom and you feel exhausted all the time or experience chronic pain, take a yoga class, study mindfulness. These are the ways to achieve that envied work-life balance, not demanding medicinal interventions, wed to structural changes such as better parental leave policies or childcare at the workplace. Medically controversial painful conditions, those in which no pathology could be found to explain ongoing pain and disability, has generated lengthy debates in the medical literature. Although the bulk of my work to date has focused on the ways popular yoga wear corporations and famous yoga gurus embody a neoliberal ethic. Think t-shirts with "good vibes only" appliqued across the front. The discourses I describe as neoliberal in these spiritual commodities are almost ubiquitous in contemporary culture. In fact, I would argue that many of the factors responsible for the ongoing stigmatization of those suffering from pain, especially women, and arguments for self-management interventions are embedded in the dominant ideology and structures of neoliberal capitalism. Given that, I want to turn to the ways a neoliberal ethic is present in the literature on pain medicine, and more specifically ask what we should make of the discourses common in the pain literature on self-management programs that suggest they offer so-called patient-centered, self-care, and holistic approaches to pain. Here I'm following the charge of Daniel Carr in his 2016 President's Message to the American Academy of Pain Medicine, in which he suggested that, quote, the depth and complexity of pain patients' experiences are not easily captured by purely quantitative data, end quote. So let's start with the meaning of words, which we love to do in the humanities. Attention to the etymology of stigma and pain might help us better understand their roles and meanings in contemporary society, and especially how those in pain are perceived and therefore what leads them to be stigmatized. The term stigma is derived from the Greek and originally meant a mark made by a pointed instrument. The mark was either cut or burned into the skin of criminals, slaves, or traitors in order to identify them as flawed or morally polluting. They were to be avoided or shunned. Today, we use stigma to refer to personal attributes that are generally considered to be shameful, discrediting, or undesirable. Like charisma, stigma is social. It entails both personal attributes and a society's interpretation of them. Commenting on the landmark 2011 report of the Institute of Medicine, Relieving Pain in America, Carr provided three major themes that he argued convey the stigma experienced by nearly every patient with chronic pain. These included the influence of moralizing attitudes, frank disbelief as to the reality of their pain, which in turn reflects the pain's invisibility. The word pain is derived from the Greek pona, the personified spirit of retribution, vengeance, and punishment for heinous crimes. Given the etymologies of pain and stigma, it should not be surprising that recent research on pain stigma illuminates the moral judgment people suffer from living with pain, especially alleged laziness, as well as failing to get better after receiving medical interventions. The failure is often attributed to the patients themselves, their non-compliance, not the medical interventions or the medical system. Even physicians use moralizing terms, such as illness-focused, demanding, and medicalizing when characterizing patients in pain. Research suggests that guilt is a common experience in patients with chronic pain, who can become acutely aware of deeply rooted cultural expectations that are morally laden, causing them to feel guilty for being unable to meet those expectations, including accessing a plausible explanation for their pain together with a socially acceptable medical diagnosis. Accepting that their identity may have changed due to the pain, meeting the physical and emotional demands made by family and work, countering unfair judgments made by colleagues, and being restored to full health following what was considered to have been appropriate medical treatment. Some research on perceptions of women suffering from fibromyalgia, for example, found the following: expressions of disbelief as to the validity of the diagnosis itself, seeing these women's diagnosis as the medicalization of psychosocial problems, and the failure of patients to try hard enough to combat their illness or taking a free ride. Another study of women suffering from fibromyalgia found that they experienced pressures to conform to social standards and thus become worthy patients in the eyes of their moralizing clinicians. Then there's the problem that people living with pain are often accused of malingering. Malingering is a term used not only to refer to those believed to be faking pain, but also those who are loath to work for a living, avoid arrest, evade criminal prosecution, receive medication for dubious reasons, and gain admission to the hospital for shelter. In other words, it connotes elements of cheating, immoral behavior, laziness, and transgressing social boundaries. When members of a society perceive others as receiving undeserved benefits, financial or otherwise, we can imagine how blemishes of character might be imposed upon those receiving the benefits, which in turn contributes to stigmatization. How any particular patient is seen in the eyes of clinicians or society at large may depend upon a variety of factors operating in situations where benefits are made available to those in need of them. For example, clinicians might display sympathy toward their patients based on their perceptions of whether the illness was acquired through praiseworthy or contemptible means. As Neil Shurik observes, quote, clinicians struggle with animosity towards patients when the moral attitude contaminates the clinical attitude. That is, when clinicians feel justified in holding patients responsible for some aspect of their illness, end quote. This attitude that patients are responsible for their pain pervades the literature on pain medicine and justifications for self-management programs. The perception that patients are responsible for their pain could result in societies inflicting sanctions on such people to coerce them towards the right way of life, in which any benefits obtained are deserved. Here's where self-management programs enter the scene. Self-management is a term used loosely in the pain literature to refer to a wide range of programs through which the individual is expected to play an active role in the management of their pain and healing. The assumption is that these programs are patient-centered insofar as they acknowledge the patient's roles in their own healing processes and therefore have the potential to provide more efficient and comprehensive pain management. Interestingly, much of the literature on self-management programs note that these are relatively safe, cost-effective, and less likely to be stigmatized compared to other treatment approaches, most notably prescription medications, but also behavioral interventions or invasive procedures. Many studies suggest that given the comorbidity of chronic pain and inherent complications, given the comorbidity of chronic pain and inherent complications associated with treating this complex condition, active self-care programs like mindfulness and yoga should be considered. However, as Carr notes, quote, non-drug means of pain control, such as cognitive behavioral therapies, while valuable, are, like Lamaze breathing for labor pain, not sufficient or even suited for everyone. Insurers often limit payment for such services, end quote. So my concern is not that patient-centered self-management programs are not effective in alleviating some of the symptoms certain pain patients experience. In fact, according to many patients with chronic pain, they are effective, and I believe them. Rather, my concern is that these programs stand in place of addressing social and environmental stressors related to race, ethnicity, gender, sex, disability, and class that contribute to lifetime adversity and disadvantage, and that are important to increasing our understanding of pain. Pain stigma affects people suffering from chronic pain, as do social inequities and inequities in access to care and healthy food. People who are already socially and economically disadvantaged have fewer of those resources, adequate pain assessment and treatment needed to resist pain's debilitating effects. As I already mentioned, chronic pain affects a higher proportion of women than men, yet women are nonetheless less likely to receive treatment. And studies in the US have found that chronic disease, psychological distress, Medicaid insurance, and lower education levels are also associated with higher incidence of pain. Furthermore, there's a significant gap between the evaluation and treatment of pain in white people and its evaluation and treatment in Black and Hispanic people, who are also far more likely to report experiencing severe pain. Lack of attention to social and environmental factors, along increased attention to the role of the patient in taking responsibility for their own pain, may increase health inequity among those most likely to be affected by pain. Carr suggests, quote, identifying and addressing social, emotional, family, and environmental factors can impact the success of the clinical encounter of the patient with pain more effectively than time spent fruitlessly seeking a pain generator, end quote. Likewise, Addressing these factors could impact the types of interventions we adopt, including structural interventions that might address and prevent some of the suffering and pain to begin with. In other words, my concern is that prescriptions for self-management might serve to replace attention to the structural factors related to pain among already disadvantaged populations. Now, believe it or not, I do not mean to offer just one more voice bemoaning self-care commodities as numbing devices through which consumers ignore the political and structural problems of neoliberal capitalism, or as the corruption of or loss of authentic religious forms, authentic mindfulness or authentic yoga. Many scholars have already offered referenda on such commodities and practices, suggesting they merely serve as palliatives or coping mechanisms. These commodities and practices, in their view, function like a fetish that helps consumers feel as if they've escaped reality. In other words, they offer consumers an escape into an experience of the present moment, of a romanticized or orientalized other, or an idealized ancient past, which allows them to imagine themselves as separate from the busyness of everyday life, and by extension, disconnected from the social and economic relations of global capitalism and its environmental consequences. These critical scholarly contributions examine the material and social operations of self-care commodities, pursued with a sensitivity to subtle and sometimes not so subtle power dynamics, complicating any straightforward progress narrative about religious or spiritual democratization, increased choice, or individual autonomy among consumers, pointing out that these forms of spirituality and self-care ultimately direct their address to the middle and upper classes, effectively erasing the problems faced by the vast majority of the population from its view. Furthermore, as much as individual consumers are not in control of their physical living conditions or places on the socioeconomic hierarchy, shopping for such commodities gives consumers a sense of control over their lives. Adherents use the notion of consumer choice to convince themselves they are in control of their health, self-care, happiness, and empowerment. So all of this has been said. And while acknowledging these insights of other studies, I propose what I think is a more nuanced analysis. I do this by asking what we should make of the subversive discourses of spirituality and self-care that do call on adherents to think beyond the individual and even out into the environment. The yoga industry's products, for example, range from t-shirts with revolution appliqued across the front to environmentally friendly yoga mats. What should we make of the feminist discourses, the calls for women's empowerment that are nearly ubiquitous in spiritual and self-care discourses? Some spiritual and self-care consumers might greenwash the products they buy, from yoga apparel to tableware. Everywhere in the developed world, plastic has taken over our households, accessories, and even our clothes. And there's growing concern over the images broadcast across mainstream media of plastic waste crowding oceans and beaches. Spiritual consumers might respond by opting for the high-end apparel of Sattva Living, which offers, quote, mindfully designed organic fashion. The company claims to improve the health and wellness of conscious consumers, as well as the lives of Indian organic farmers by partnering with Suminter India Organics and working under the model of creative capitalism, an approach that ensures that a portion of profits are invested back into the communities and agricultural programs of the farmers. Sattva Living products are sold across India, as well as the United States, and are available, for example, at Whole Foods Market, where spiritual consumers might also shop for eco-friendly, biodegradable paper plates. The multi-millionaire entrepreneur John Mackey uses the phrase conscious capitalism, arguing that capitalism's heroic spirit is the key to creating a world in which all people live lives of prosperity. What about these entrepreneurs and corporations profiting off self-care commodities that claim to counter the problems of unbridled capitalism with various forms of conscious capitalism? In the literature on pain medicine, self-management programs are often described as a necessary alternative to other treatments, as more holistic and patient-centered, as considering the interplay of biological, psychological, and social and cultural factors by empowering the patients to themselves play an active role in the healing process. So I suggest we attend to these subversive elements, suggesting that rather than a mode through which consumers and patients ignore, escape, or are numbed to the problems of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, many self-care commodities, practices, corporations, and entrepreneurs do actually acknowledge those problems and in fact subvert them, but they subvert them through mere gestures. From provocative taglines printed across t-shirts or packaging to various forms of charitable giving, self-care commodities and practices serve as a strategy through which subversion itself is contained. In other words, neoliberal spirituality and self-management programs represent areas of religion and medicine through which protest against the reigning socioeconomic and cultural order is simultaneously expressed and contained. Drawing on Mark Fisher's work on capitalist realism, the dominant idea that there are no viable alternatives to capitalism, I suggest that choosing self-care interventions and practices that represent revolutionary, empowering, egalitarian, environmentally friendly, holistic, or authentically ancient values can best be understood as a form of gestural anti-capitalism or gestural subversion. Fisher describes anti-capitalist counter discourses that are widely disseminated in pop culture. He discusses, for example, Hollywood movies or television. How often is the villain the evil corporation? The film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume without blame or guilt. In other words, in my view, yoga, mindfulness, and other forms of self-care or self-management with their countercultural or subversive gestures are domesticated to the dominant culture, to a neoliberal capitalist rationality. Yet another way to put this is that using these practices entails a misrecognition, whereby the consumer confronts certain social and environmental problems, which are caused or exacerbated by capitalism, by consuming. Most significantly, self-care industries individualize what are fundamentally social and environmental issues in society. This is obviously cohesive with neoliberal capitalism. It's sort of the con, as we discussed in another session, of neoliberal capitalism. It follows an ideology that you need to work on yourself rather than look to social resources for solutions to your problems or demand structural or environmental changes. Their discourses are highly useful in depoliticizing the oppressive and increasingly grim reality of life on this planet. So back now to planetary crisis and pandemic. The main force behind the environmental crisis is capitalism's global exponential growth. Capitalists recognize no limits to its expansion. No amount of profit, wealth, or consumption is enough or too much. As a consequence of capitalism's exponential growth, as I speak, the world suffers from increased global warmth and the natural catastrophes to which it contributes. The editors of over 200 scientific journals in medicine who signed on to the editorial I mentioned earlier call rising temperatures and losses in biodiversity the world's greatest public health threats. Addressing health, pandemic, and climate change, they argue, go hand in hand. And if health is our focus, then environmental degradation should be of utmost concern. I'm suggesting that scholars of spirituality and health join these health professionals and the environmental scientists they cite in their demand for rapid action to prevent further planetary and healthcare catastrophes. The involvement of self-care discourses, disciplines, and programs and institutions here is only one factor in the bigger problem then, which is of course the way capitalism destroys the social, the collective, and the environment. And protest gets contained in various ways. So now to the title of my talk, Eat Your Own Leg. This message, alongside an image of an adorable lamb, appears printed across t-shirts donned by generally affluent white vegans. White veganism tends to be about single issue advocacy through the most privileged of lenses. Like the discourses of yoga wear, from peace, love, yoga to good vibes only, that I discussed in recent scholarship on the politics of global spirituality, these vegan commodities offer up counter discourses that get contained through commodification. Now, I'm not a scholar of the earth or health sciences. I do not know either sets of literature. I am a humanities scholar with an expertise in religion. Like many of us here, I hear about breakthroughs in and highlights of those literatures and read quite a lot about the environment, the current planetary crisis, and developments in medicine, especially with regard to the current pandemic. But this hardly constitutes real fluency on my part, much less scholarly expertise. Scholarly fluency or expertise, however, is not the only place or even the most critical place where cultural change generally happens. It often comes from grassroots or local activist movements. So we should ask what activists are doing to refuse containment of their dissent. We should be asking what insights activists working on overlapping injustices, addressing animal justice, food justice, healthcare justice, racial justice, and environmental justice give us into what constitutes radical resistance and how that includes a commitment to both human and non-human animal liberation. Activists' voices draw attention to new worlds of empathy and critical thinking that can open up important avenues of solidarity across communities. They help us acknowledge the ways our capitalist practices and institutions are complicit in overlapping forms of oppression. They show us new ways to map, visualize, and imagine social, animal, and environmental justice in order to prepare strategically for just transitions and futures that are not possible under our current social and environmental conditions. Visit a sanctuary farm where farmers save animals from the slaughter they would have endured either on small local farms or large industrial farms. You will find yourself radically reoriented or perhaps disoriented in your relationship to non-human animals. There, each animal is treated as a living being with their own personality and very much capable of pain. This space is out of sync with the world around it, where humans consume animals for their own purposes and pleasure. Or consider the Black vegan movement. In the United States, Black people are almost 3 times more likely to be vegan and vegetarian than other Americans. And 8% of Black Americans, are vegan or vegetarian, compared to just 3% of the general population. They tend to make arguments for veganism in terms of Black health and food justice. Eliminating animal products, they argue, reduces the likelihood of developing chronic illnesses like diabetes, cancer, and hypertension that especially plague Black communities. Many Black vegans argue that advocating for Black communities' access to plant-based foods is more important now than ever before, as COVID-19 ravages many Black communities, in part because of their higher rate of pre-existing chronic conditions. Numerous studies show that plant-based diets are associated with a lower risk of developing these and other chronic conditions. Socioeconomic factors, including poverty and living farther from grocery stores offering quality plant-based options, but closer to fast food and racial injustice, Black vegans and vegetarians argue, contributes to the poor diet of many Black communities. Embracing vegan and vegetarian diets go hand in hand with addressing food injustice. Black-owned organizations are emerging that deliver vegan and vegetarian foods to predominantly Black inner-city communities or hold events like Black Veg and Vegan Festivals, created by and for the Black community in order to raise awareness about the intersections of racial, health, and food injustices. Many also lobby to improve animal welfare, addressing the overlapping injustices of white supremacy, police brutality, and brutality against non-human animals, and capitalism. The Black vegan movement also has roots in the American civil rights movements. Dick Gregory, a famed Black civil rights activist who marched alongside Martin Luther King, gave up meat in 1965 and later became a strict vegan. Quote, "Because I am a civil rights activist, I am also an animal rights activist. Animals and humans suffer and die alike. Violence causes the same pain, the same spilling of blood, the same stench of death, the same arrogant, cruel, and vicious taking of life. We shouldn't be a part of it," he argued. Black vegans and sanctuary farmers are non-compliant. They challenge social constructions, binaries, domination, and normalcy. They demand that we do more than engage in gestural subversions, donning t-shirts with the message, "Eat your own leg," or buying expensive vegan foods at Whole Foods Market. They demand instead that we radically reorient our relationships with non-human animals. That we not only acknowledge animal suffering, but cease killing and eating them, and instead live among them as members of shared communities. That we acknowledge how chronic disease and systemic racism are currently inextricable and make plant-based foods accessible to Black communities and in public schools and hospitals. Their efforts resist white supremacy and capitalism. Imagine and enact forms of solidarity between communities dispossessed by capitalism's death-dealing structures, and provide insights into the experience of being marginalized and what resistance, not simply gestural subversion, looks like in this present moment of history. Environmental concerns are not just environmental, but rather one way to address other problems in society and to change social structures. Likewise, healthcare is not just about the human body's, the human body's health or even society, but also our relationship with the environment and non-human animals. Eating animals is rooted in a mix of cultural convictions, racial, gendered, and sexual politics, and a long-standing wariness of environmental science. In other words, consuming animals is not just about the dominion and consumption of them. It is also a way humans slip racial, ethnic, religious, sexual, and anti-scientific politics into arguments for superiority over other humans, as well as the very planet we all inhabit. So will we continue with business as usual, under the mistaken notion that capitalist industries, including the meat and dairy industries, can undergo unlimited expansion on a planet with finite natural resources? If we do, there will be more extreme weather patterns, floods, droughts, and forest fires. There will be more extinctions and losses in biodiversity. There will be more pandemics. There will be more suffering for humans and other animals. There will eventually be not just social problems like inequity in healthcare, but the very death of life on this planet. Thank you very much.
Always likes to end on a happy note. Thanks, Anna.
Sorry about that.
That's great. So we have about 10 minutes for some questions and comments.
Did I leave enough time?
Yep, that's perfect. Yep, perfect. Who'd like to go first? Just to be clear, it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but that in order to affect the changes you're talking about in making a plant-based diet possible for everybody, that requires and/or would result in a full-on global revolution.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's what, that's interestingly,
Yeah.
that sounds really, oh, how unrealistic. But that's the reality of our historical moment.
Yeah.
That it is apocalypse. Apocalypse is now, it's happening. And the only way to prevent it is radical reorientation toward the environment and non-human animals. And over 200, we're not listening, over 200 editors of the top medical journals said this thing. They said this. They said, we have to make radical change now. It's got to be revolutionary. The likelihood of that happening is very small, but that is the only option.
Are there incremental changes one can make en route to that? That would respect issues around, for example, widespread global concerns around indigenous rights, right? And we talked about this last night about indigenous peoples having lifeways that are strongly attached to usually consuming animal protein. And so on the one hand, one wants to respect that very important justice movement in our culture, while at the same time not at all questioning the core argument of those 200 editors and the realities of climate change.
Yeah, and the fact is those cultures aren't going to survive if the end of the planet is near,
Yeah.
right? And so if sustaining life on this planet is something worth pursuing, then we have to address these bigger issues and have radical revolution. If sustaining, certain respect for certain cultural practices and accept that apocalypse is the next thing and that we're not going to prevent that or even try to prevent it, then that's another set of priorities.
I guess one could argue that the numbers of people that I'm talking about, the indigenous communities that have these lifeways, are actually numerically small, and their footprint, carbon and otherwise, is relatively small relative to those of us who are the main consumers of the world.
Yeah,
maybe
so
that's
like
wrong.
target indigenous communities in their consumption of meat would be a sort of gestural subversion, wouldn't it? It would distract us from the real enormous causes of suffering: industrialized animal agriculture, capitalism, meat and dairy industries. Yeah, so I mean, I don't think that's the solution to say, well, the problem is the indigenous people, because they, have this long culture of eating meat.
Justin? All right, yeah.
Thanks. I just want to start by saying, thank you so much for really engaging 50-minute talk. I mean, just like stuck on every word, and I definitely empathize, share many of your goals, and respect a lot of the analysis. I want to ask though about, I guess it sounds a bit like a common thing that's come up is that the actual bulk of the greenhouse gases are coming from the extractive industries, right? That there's a handful of fossil fuel corporations that are responsible for some huge amount of the greenhouse gases. And I was kind of surprised that I don't think you mentioned extractive industries in the whole talk. And instead, the focus on kind of eating practices, right? It seems to really kind of individualize choices that consumers are making and substitute an alternative consumption model as, the kind of revolution, right? And it does seem to kind of fit a bit with this like individualization of choice as the path forward, instead of, right, things like reforming the extractive industries, which is like a systemic thing that needs to be done on a global international kind of consensus scale. So I'm just kind of wondering, trying to think through that.
Yeah, I think the difference, the argument I'm making is not that individual consumers should be focused on their individual choices. And that's why I point to the Black vegan movement as a model for what we should be doing. And that is demanding structural changes, access to plant-based foods in public schools and in hospitals, government intervention and changes in government policies around access to food. So those are structural, and those are the demands made largely by the Black vegan movement.
And I'm sure there's huge subsidies for it.
Huge, right, yeah. And of course, to change the relationship between governments and meat and dairy industries would be radical and revolutionary, for sure. It would change our economic systems, but that's what's necessary if we're going to take climate change seriously.
I know we talked about this a bit last night too, but like, is there a way in which you could actually see Indigenous food sovereignty and eating meat and animal products as another one of those radical ways to subvert like this sort of whole, like, I really agree with everything you're saying in your talk, but in a way, eating meat could actually be like, that allows Indigenous nations to remain sovereign in some parts of the world and having their own foodway practices, not relying on the Canadian government to provide them with food. That gives them their sovereignty, and that gives them the ability to fight those, like, also like Indigenous peoples, obviously not as a monolith, but many Indigenous nations and people are like fighting so many extractive industries and are really like taking that forefront for us and like really fighting the climate crisis. So in a way, it actually could possibly be seen as another part of like these completely radical movements that you're advocating for.
Yeah, so again, I don't think humans, I personally don't think humans should kill and eat animals. I think there's ethical arguments to be made for our, increased access globally to plant-based diets. That means, we're not justified in killing animals. So that's a sort of separate argument though, than the argument I'm making. Because I'm not interested in targeting, a small percentage of, of people, these Indigenous populations and their foodways and practices. I'm interested in targeting large industries and corporations, which are contributing to climate change and losses to biodiversity at a scale that isn't even comparable to Indigenous communities' practices. So sure, if there was a sort of bracketing off, like we have religious exemptions for vaccination, right? That would be like such a small fraction that it wouldn't be relevant to the issues I'm addressing in terms of certain planetary crisis and an end to life on this planet. Although there's another argument to be made, an ethical argument for just not eating animals.
Rachel, there's a question on Zoom, I think, yeah? So, sorry, I should have mentioned that those of you who are on Zoom who do want to ask a question, I think I need to send it to the chat to Rachel, and then she can untether you.
I think I'll just ask it is
Okay.
the easiest thing probably. Sure. So Amanda Pat asks, if gestural subversion is present in neoliberal methods of personal wellness, both in medical and spiritual industries, as well as in, sorry, just a second, of course I'm doing this. Sorry, it's complicated, as well as in recommendations for environmental activism, recycling, et cetera. Because these are contained and constrained by the dominant narrative, what would non-gestural subversion look like? What stances and actions would allow us to look at the capitalist system, see where it could be transformed, and find a new way forward that really is focused on relationship and connection, on the value of life in all its forms?
Yeah, I'm not sure I really got that last part, but the first part in terms of what non-gestural subversion looks like. I think that's why we have to look to activists who are non-compliant or non-cooperative with social norms, with the dominance of these huge industries like the meat and dairy industries, and ask what they're doing and how they're living in radically reoriented ways. And in some ways, Indigenous communities do this, toward the environment and non-human animals.
Mm.
We've got to look at who's doing this kind of work. And, I think of myself as a scholar working in cultural diagnostics. Social critics, we diagnose the problems with society and culture. But it's activists who imagine alternatives and build on that diagnostic work to say, here's how we can orient ourselves toward each other, toward the environment, toward animals differently. And so that's where I'd say we look for non-gestural subversions.
In much of the research around yoga and mindfulness and their role in the contemporary arena, there's a strong sense that they are responding to a widely felt sense of the ambient toxicity of the world in which we're living, right? And then that leads people to valorize those practices in ways that, as you point out, I think can be problematic or can be a distraction. But it also leads people to sometimes toward kind of a purity discourse, which we talked about yesterday when we were trying to understand the phenomenon of conspirituality, which is this blending of New Age spirituality and conspiracy theories, which is often, when you look at them, there's strong theories related to a purity claim about the way the world should be, or the way this particular individual or this guru or whatever is. And I wonder is there any fear in your articulation of the problem, or any sense in your articulation of the problem of this veering toward a purity discourse, that this is a kind of a strong.
In fact, vegans are oftentimes accused of being moralizing. And expecting that everyone consume the same way. And I think that if we nuance the arguments and accept that not all consumption is the same, right? We can make space for, say, indigenous communities having a unique relationship with non-human animals. Or we can make space for somebody who might have a certain health condition to have a different relationship with non-human animals and actually eat them if their health condition necessitates it. But the fact is that animals suffer tremendously for our pleasure. Plant-based foods are accessible. We can make them accessible. Sorry, we have the capacity, given our technology, to make them accessible to the global population. And so I'm not arguing for a sort of moral purity that you can't, have a sort of complex relationship with animals, so that it's not always perfect, and sometimes you do consume or use them just like we consume or use each other. Because we all do. I mean, and we don't just do that with non-human animals, but we do it with humans as well. I'm not expecting a sort of moral purity, like we're all going to be perfectly vegan in every way all the time. But it certainly could lend itself to that. And then that itself would be a sort of distraction from, I think, worthy goals of veganism or vegetarianism. Or sanctuary farms, becoming overly moralizing. Again, it becomes a sort of, focus on individuals as opposed to societies.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much, Andrea. Please join me in thanking Andrea.
Thanks.
One more. Oh, Scott will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, it's awesome, as usual. This is Andrea's second visit here, by the way. So she came in 2017 and gave a great keynote lecture on her first book on yoga. And this is partially where you began to develop some of these ideas that are kind of fully flourished now. So, there we go. Yeah, we don't mess around. Okay, join us for Dan's talk next week. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.